This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silence them. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 135, Case Update Special number 10. In today's episode, I'll provide updates on several cases I've covered previously on the podcast. The stories I'll be updating today include those of Keaton Boggs, Kerrigan Rutherford, Maxwell Schollenberger, Nakota Kelly, Scotty McMillan, Caliyah McNabb, and Dawson McKinney. I'd like to thank my newest patrons, Jennifer W. from Galesburg, Illinois, and Angela C. from New Orleans, Louisiana. Thank you both so much for your support. On another Patreon-related note, I'm working on the next Patreon-exclusive bonus minisode, which are available to patrons pledging $10 or more per month. Keep an eye out for that later this week. To make a pledge, you can visit patreon.com/stlcpod. I didn't plan to release another case update special quite this soon after the last two, but I was working on putting together a story that I ended up having to postpone for legal reasons. If all goes well, I should be releasing that episode within a couple of weeks. It's a story that will definitely infuriate you, and it's also a story that needs to be told, but the last thing I want is for my episode to impede justice in any way. In the meantime, let's get into some case updates. In episode 30, I told you about 5-year-old Keaton Boggs. On March 18, 2020, Keaton was airlifted to J.W. Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, West Virginia, unresponsive. He had suffered a head injury that caused bleeding in his brain and eyes, as well as bruises in varying degrees of healing all over his body and head. After he died 2 days later, Keaton's death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head, which the pathologist believed was caused by repeated blows. After Keaton's death, 3 members of his paternal family were charged with death of a child by parent, guardian, custodian, or other person by child abuse: his grandmother, Michelle Boggs, her daughter, Chastity Wodzinski, and Chastity's husband, Peter P.J. Wodzinski, Jr. Keaton had been in the custody of his father's family since the previous year, when his dad, U.S. Army veteran Christopher Boggs, died from a suspicious drug overdose. Many believe Michelle, a known financial scammer, may have orchestrated the custody arrangement to gain access to her son's death benefits. At their respective trials in March and April of 2021, P.J. Wodzinski and Michelle Boggs were convicted of allowing Keaton's abuse to occur, meaning neither was technically convicted of inflicting the fatal abuse. Both were ultimately sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. I last updated Keaton's case in December of 2021. The trial of Chastity Wodzinski, who had been held since her arrest in the North Central Regional Jail in Greenwood, West Virginia, began on March 21, 2022. All 3 trials were overseen by Judge James Madish, who ruled at the beginning of Chastity's trial that neither Michelle's nor PJ's convictions were allowed to be used as evidence against her. The trial lasted for 2.5 days. In the state's opening arguments, prosecutors told the jury that while grandmother Michelle Boggs was Keaton's legal custodian, his aunt and uncle, Chastity and PJ, were responsible for his daily care. They mentioned multiple doctor's appointments for Keaton that Chastity canceled, using a number of excuses. They suggested that Chastity was trying to cover up Keaton's abuse. Defense attorneys opened with arguments that Chastity was not home at the time Keaton's fatal injuries were inflicted, so she could not have carried them out. On day 1, friends of Michelle testified about her living with them on several separate occasions after the death of her son, Christopher. She was living with one of these friends at the time of her arrest. Keaton's one-time therapist, Molly Barbario, testified that she received a referral to treat Keaton for bizarre outbursts and behavior issues. She met with Keaton once for about 10 minutes on February 5, 2020, noting nothing of importance. The next visit was scheduled for February 19th, but Chastity canceled the appointment due to supposed car trouble. The rescheduled appointment on March 4th was canceled because Michelle was in the hospital. Then, on March 17th, the family was a no-call, no-show. Although Molly was a mandatory reporter, she did not suspect abuse from her limited interaction with Keaton, so she did not make a report. Retired Special Investigator Michael Camden, formerly of the West Virginia State Police, testified that he responded to WVU Medicine Ruby Memorial Hospital around 10 p.m. on March 18, 2020, to assist the state police in interviewing Chastity and Michelle after Keaton was airlifted to the hospital with severe injuries. In the interview, Chastity explained that Keaton hadn't felt well the previous day, but he had improved that morning. He used the bathroom early in the morning, went back to bed, and got up around 10 a.m. Chastity said she ran errands that day, and when she returned home, she could not wake Keaton, at which point she and Michelle drove him to the hospital. Her husband, PJ, who was home with Keaton all day, could not explain why their nephew was unresponsive. Chastity also engaged in some classic victim blaming during her police interview, calling Keaton clumsy and describing an incident in which the family dog knocked him down the stairs. She also claimed that the 5-year-old took a steak knife to his penis, which caused a 4-centimeter laceration, and that Keaton also hit himself in the eye with a toy hammer and woke up with both eyes blackened. The day after the initial interview, Chastity went to the police station and changed her statement, adding that her mother, Michelle, went with her to run errands on the 18th and wasn't home with PJ. Chastity even made the statement to police, "I don't know what happened to that little boy." She told police she lied to them in the previous interview because Michelle asked her to, not wanting to get in trouble or lose custody of Keaton. Dr. Casey McCluskey, a pediatric ICU doctor at WVU Medicine Children's, testified as an expert in pediatric critical care. She treated Keaton when he arrived at Ruby on the evening of March 18th, and she described for the court his horrific injuries, including 2 black eyes, bruises all over his head in multiple stages of healing, and bruises on his hips, legs, sides, and the top of his feet. She said Keaton wasn't moving without the use of sedatives, and she had immediate concerns of child abuse, so she contacted a forensic nurse. Over the next 36 hours, Dr. McCluskey testified, Keaton's brain herniated, meaning it swelled, crushing itself against the bottom of his skull. Dr. McCluskey ultimately declared Keaton dead on March 20, 2020, naming his cause of death as non-accidental trauma resulting in brain death. Dr. McCluskey has also authored pieces on self-harm in children, and she testified that in her opinion, Keaton's injuries were not self-inflicted. That is incredibly valuable testimony because both Michelle and Chastity claimed that Keaton caused his own worst injuries. The next day, Dr. Donald Pogman, forensic pathologist and deputy chief medical examiner for the West Virginia office of the chief medical examiner, testified about performing Keaton's autopsy on March 24, 2020. In his report, the pathologist took note of Keaton's extensive bruising, noting that some of the contusions on Keaton's head and face were starting to heal. He also noted clotted blood on Keaton's brain, which he said was not normal and indicated a fairly new injury. He opined that Chastity's story of the dog knocking Keaton down the stairs did not align with his findings. Dr. Brian Policano, a pediatrician who saw Keaton once, also testified. He saw Keaton in his office on January 29, 2020, after the family canceled one appointment in September of 2019 and pulled a no-call, no-show to 2 later appointments. Chastity also did not bring Keaton to a scheduled appointment on January 3, 2020, although she did bring one of her own children. Both Michelle and Chastity brought Keaton to the appointment on January 29th, telling Dr. Policano that Keaton displayed regressive behavior, self-harm, and acting out. The doctor noted that Keaton had multiple visible marks and injuries. The women explained away Keaton's black eye, saying he hit himself with a toy hammer. The scratches, they said, were caused by the dog and by Keaton falling into a chicken wire fence. The doctor believed these stories and did not, at the time, suspect abuse. Both sides gave closing arguments the following day, after which the jury was sent to deliberate. It took jurors only an hour and 25 minutes to find Chastity Wodzinski guilty of knowingly allowing the abuse that killed her 5-year-old nephew, Keaton Michael Boggs. Almost 9 months later, in December of 2022, Judge Madish finally sentenced Chastity to the same sentence her husband and mother had received, an indeterminate term of 15 years to life in the West Virginia prison system, followed by 10 years of supervised release. That is, if she is ever released. One of Chastity's attorneys told the court that his client would appeal. Her husband, PJ, had already appealed his conviction, which was affirmed in October of 2022 by the State of West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. Michelle Boggs is serving her sentence in the Laine Correctional Center in West Columbia, West Virginia, the same prison where sisters Julie Browning and Sherry Tichenell are serving sentences of 3 to 15 years for child neglect resulting in the death of 8-year-old Rayleigh Browning, whose story I updated a few weeks ago in episode 132. Michelle's next parole hearing is scheduled for March 20th, 2035. If she lives that long, she will be 63 years old. PJ Wodzinski is serving his sentence in the Huttonsville Correctional Center in Randolph County. His parole hearing is scheduled for March 18th, 2035. He will be 47 at that time. 32-year-old Chastity Wodzinski is incarcerated in the North Central Regional Jail and Correctional Facility in Greenwood. I couldn't find a scheduled date for her first parole hearing. Next up is the case of 6-year-old Kerrigan Rutherford, who I told you about in episode 31. Despite years of DCFS and police involvement due to constant reports of abuse and neglect of Kerry and her younger sister, the authorities did not intervene until it was too late. On July 2, 2020, police and EMS responded to a home in Boulder Hill, Illinois, on a call of an unresponsive 6-year-old girl. Upon arrival, they found Kerry dead inside her family's rental house. Investigators said it appeared Kerry had been dead for some time. Her 3-year-old sister was taken into protective custody. Kerry's mother and stepfather, Courtney and James Davidson, moved out of the house immediately after Kerry died, leaving the home uninhabitable, as they had their previous residence. A foul stench permeated the house, and throughout the home were piles of trash, dirty diapers, and feces on the floors, carpets, and stairs. On the floor in the dining area, police found broken eggs, spilled soda, rotting food, and both clean and dirty diapers. Roaches were found in the kitchen, and prescription bottles for about 10 medications were found in the bedrooms. When Kerry's autopsy was performed, the medical examiner found the 6-year-old to be wearing a disposable diaper, soaked with urine and containing a moderate amount of fecal matter. After toxicology results returned, Kerry's death was ruled a homicide caused by prescription drug toxicity. Kerry had ingested a lethal dose of olanzapine, an antipsychotic drug commonly prescribed to treat schizophrenia or bipolar mania in patients aged 13 or older. Kerry's mother had previously been diagnosed as bipolar. The level of olanzapine in Kerry's blood was nearly 10 times the maximum recommended dosage. James and Courtney Davidson were arrested and charged with 1 count each of involuntary manslaughter and 2 counts each of endangering the life or health of a child. Both were booked into the Kendall County Jail. I last updated Kerry's story in December of 2021. Since then, the legal cases of her mother and stepfather have been resolved. James Davidson's trial took place in February of 2022 before 23rd Circuit Chief Judge Robert Pilmer. Represented by Kendall County Public Defender Clyde Guillermo, James often buried his face in his hands during the 3 days of testimony and evidence. He cried openly on day 3 while jurors watched his August 6, 2020 interview with Kendall County Sheriff's Deputy Brian Harrell, during which James's story changed multiple times. By the end of the video, James confessed to the deputy that Kerry wouldn't sleep, so he crushed 2 pills he found in a bottle on the floor, mixed them into a small bowl of cottage cheese, and gave it to his stepdaughter. Based on testimony given during the trial, both parents gave their daughter the same medication to try to get her to sleep on the night of July 1, 2020. Evidence showed Kerry had ingested at least 5 of the 10-milligram capsules. Jurors saw graphic photos of the family's filthy home, which was strewn with knives and other hazards, including multiple prescription pill bottles. They also saw a photo of Kerry, dead on her back on the bed with her arms over the edge of the bed and prescription bottles all over the floor below her. Blood was crusted around her little nose, and a pair of scissors lay on the bed nearby. On February 16, 2022, after 4 hours of jury deliberations, James was found guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and endangering the life of a child. At his sentencing hearing on April 15, 2022, James read a prepared statement before the court, which included this clip.
My Princess Kerrigan. Kerry was such a wonderful little girl that brought me happiness that I never thought I would ever have. Kerry was the sweetest angel that came into my life. I really loved Kerry with all my heart and wanted the best for her and would never hurt her. All I wanted was for Kerry to have a great life, and I tried so hard to be a good father, but I failed as a father. And I wanted to say, I'm so sorry, Kerry.
At the hearing, Kendall County First Assistant State's Attorney Mark Schilfka said,
"This is a man who was smart enough to lie when he's interviewed by the police, to try to avoid being held responsible for what happened to that little girl. Where the defendant's lies are, lays the body of Kerrigan Rutherford. He went so far as to actually blame the doctors. He says in one part of the statement that doctors are the ones who failed Kerrigan. It's their fault. She's dead. It's all about him and blaming everybody else. He can't accept responsibility for his role, the role that he played in the death of that girl, the girl who calls him daddy. It's offensive. And this is something the court can take into consideration in fashioning a sentence."
WSPY reported that several times during the prosecution's statement, James covered his eyes, rested his head on the table, or shook his head no, otherwise showing no emotion. The defense provided mitigating information, telling the court that James was abused by his stepfather as a child and bullied by other children at school. James's mother said he was in the special education program during school due to learning disabilities and ADHD. In the end, James received a sentence of 12 years in prison with credit for 629 days in the Kendall County Jail. He is eligible for sentence reduction due to good behavior. Judge Pilmer denied James's request for protective custody. Courtney testified under immunity against her husband at his trial, during which she said she didn't remember what happened the night of Kerry's death. In her police interview, Courtney told investigators she gave Kerry 3 of the olanzapine pills. In May of 2022, Courtney pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. According to the terms of her plea agreement, she received a sentence of 10 years in prison, with credit for 638 days served in the Kendall County Jail. After her sentencing, defense attorney Michael Blake told the press,
"I honestly wasn't expecting a plea offer, and she agreed. I did not expect the state to offer that. I thought a fair offer considering what James got. I think that Courtney was a little less culpable, and we didn't think we'd do any better going through the whole pre-sentence investigation."
Regarding Kerry's 5-year-old sister, Mr. Blake said,
"Both James and Courtney have waived so that Courtney's sister can adopt the other child."
When they are released from prison, can they apply to get their daughter back?
No.
So when they parole out, are they allowed to visit with the child, family gatherings?
If the sister and her husband want to allow that, absolutely.
They don't have to go to court for permission?
No.
31-year-old James Davidson is currently in custody at the Southwestern Correctional Center in East St. Louis, Illinois. His projected parole date is listed as February 6, 2026. Courtney Davidson, now 35, is serving her sentence in the Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, which is the same facility where Joanne Cunningham is serving her 35 years for the murder of her own son, 5-year-old A.J. Frund. Courtney is projected for parole on July 15, 2025. I'll take a moment here for a word from my sponsors. In episode 32, I told you the story of 12-year-old Max Schollenberger, which I last updated on the podcast in December of 2021. When Max was young, he liked Thomas the Tank Engine, playing outside, eating popsicles, and playing baseball. However, very little is known about Max during the last several years of his life. His father and stepmother, Scott Schollenberger and Kimberly Maurer, took Max away from his biological mother when he was 3 and cut off all communication with her and with members of Scott's family. Max was never enrolled in school, and the last time he saw a doctor was as a toddler. Scott lied to various people, telling some that Max was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, which was false. Court documents later stated that Scott expressed intense frustration towards Max and that he had indicated to other individuals that he was afraid of hurting him. On May 26, 2020, police in Annville, Pennsylvania discovered 12-year-old Max's emaciated body in the family's home on South White Oak Street. He was naked, smeared with feces, and slumped across a filthy bed in a dark bedroom with human waste caked on every surface, some of it so old it had begun to grow mold. The bedroom had no lights, and the windows were covered and sealed with duct tape and screws. The door was locked from the outside with metal hooks. The only furniture in the room was the bed on which Max died. At the time of his death, Max weighed 47.5 pounds, about half the average weight of a boy his age. His body had wasted away from malnutrition to the point where he could no longer have digested food. He had also suffered head trauma. His death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma, complicating starvation/malnutrition. 5 other children who lived in the home were healthy and well-nourished. Both Scott and Kim were arrested on September 11, 2020, and charged with homicide, conspiracy to commit homicide, child endangerment by a parent, and conspiracy to commit the same. In February of 2022, Scott pleaded guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which he is currently serving in the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution in Waymart. He is now 44 years old. At Kimberly's 7-day trial in March of 2022 before Judge Bradford Charles, Kimberly's attorneys tried to blame Max's abuse solely on Scott, claiming with no evidence whatsoever that Scott was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive to Kim, and wouldn't allow her to make decisions in regard to Max's care, saying she was just the girlfriend. Witnesses during the trial described Scott as mean and off-putting, saying Max was afraid of his father. 2 witnesses who spent time in the Schollenberger-Maurer home every day throughout most of 2019 and 2020 testified that they had no idea Max even existed. Lebanon County District Attorney Pierre Hess-Graf and her team demonstrated through Kim's Facebook posts, text messages, and cell phone video that she was frustrated by her inability to control Max's behavior. One text message read, "You should see Max's dinner plate. Maybe I should start taking pictures to prove I feed the asshole." She referred to Max as the little asshole throughout multiple messages. The jury saw photos of Max's body as the police found him, covered in feces, his arms and legs shriveled almost to the bone. They also heard testimony that 3 days after Max's body was found, Kim cleaned up his bedroom, converting it into a playroom for her 3 surviving children. Edward McCann, a member of the prosecution team, told the jury, "When you don't give a child enough food, and you lock them in a room, and you keep him away from any affection or love, and you look out and see him covered in his own filth, obviously starving or dying, and your decision is to let it happen, you don't get to throw up your hands and say, 'I'm so surprised, I can't believe that child died.'" At the end of the trial, after just an hour of deliberation, the jury found Kimberly Maurer guilty of all charges. After the verdict, DA Pierre Hess-Graf released a statement that said in part, "Kimberly Maurer stole Maxwell's life. The jury saw the worst of humanity during this trial, and we are forever in their debt for the strength they showed in their verdict. I want to thank the jury for its service and its verdict. We remain grateful to the caliber of local law enforcement, both the Annville Police Department with its initial response and the County Detective Bureau with its years-long investigation did truly commendable work on Maxwell's behalf. I would also like to thank Montgomery County First Assistant Edward McCann for his assistance in this trial. Your dedication to child abuse victims, to Maxwell, showed at every moment during trial preparation. While the verdict cannot ever bring Maxwell back or give him the future he desperately deserved, it finally imposed the ultimate consequence on the defendant. On June 1, 2022, Judge Charles sentenced Kimberly Moorer to life in prison plus 10 to 20 years, saying, "I have always been raised to believe there is no such thing as an unforgivable sin. But this is as close as it gets." Kim is now serving her sentence at SCI Muncie in Lycoming County, where she may have the dubious opportunity of rubbing elbows with Christy Willis, mother of Jared Burgess, the convicted killer of 3-year-old Arabella Parker. Another fellow inmate is Natasha Franks, the mother of 7-year-old Tasmir Ransom, whose story I told on the blog and in Patreon-exclusive bonus minisode number 13. On a slightly brighter note, in October of 2022, a new, inclusive playground at Anvil Elementary School was dedicated to Max's memory. The playground was christened Max's Place, and it will function as a safe place for parents to bring their children, as well as a memorial to Max. Another story I most recently updated in December of 2021 was that of 10-year-old Nakota Kelly, who I featured in episode 33. I also spoke with Nakota's mom, Haley Kelly, a few weeks after that in minisode number 1. Nakota, who was adored by his mom and his big sister, was a happy, loving, playful, energetic boy who loved baseball, bowling, football, wrestling, his cat, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Nakota was a protector who stood up to bullies despite his small stature, and he was very proud of being biracial. For many years, Nakota's mom, Haley, tried to get the family court system and the Indiana Department of Child Services to listen to her. Nakota was terrified of his unsupervised visits with his abusive father, Anthony DeBaya. Every concern Haley expressed was brushed off. Haley last complained to DCS on July 14, 2020, that Nakota had told her, "Oh, I'm dead. Don't expect me to come home. My dad is going to kill me." Due to a court order and under threat of jail, Haley had no choice but to send Nakota to his father's Indianapolis apartment for visitation that weekend. She last spoke with Nakota just after 7:30 p.m. on Saturday, July 18, 2020. About 2 hours later, Anthony's cousin in Texas called 911, saying he received a text message and a call from Anthony, who screamed, "I just killed my son." Police attempted to perform a welfare check at Anthony's apartment in the 6000 block of West Lake South Drive in Indianapolis, but because no one answered, the officer simply left. The next morning, police received a second report from a friend of Anthony, who told them Anthony said he used a bag to suffocate Nakota before taking the boy to the bathroom to make sure he was dead, and then dumping the body in an unknown location. Police entered the apartment to find a crime scene in the bathroom. Based on the blood, hair, and brain matter found in the apartment, Nakota was assumed dead. After a short manhunt, Anthony DeBaya was arrested in Missouri for his son's murder. If convicted, he could face life without parole or the death penalty. To this day, Nakota's remains have not been found. I wish with all my heart that was one of the updates I had to give you today. Unfortunately not, though. In April of 2022, Anthony's attorney, Brian K. Lamar, filed a motion to suppress some of the most damning evidence against him, that being the hair, blood, and brain matter found in Anthony's apartment. Mr. Lamar claimed police should have obtained a search warrant before entering the apartment, and that failing to do so violated Anthony's constitutional rights. At a court hearing, Deputy Prosecutor Michelle Sharp argued that the law gives police the right to enter private property under exigent circumstances when they have reason to believe someone's life might be in danger. On the morning of July 19, 2020, after the second of the two witnesses reported Anthony's confessions, police obtained a master key from the apartment office and gained entry to the small studio apartment. Finding a smear of blood and brain matter on the bathroom floor, the officers exited, immediately calling for homicide detectives. Fortunately, in July of 2022, Marion Superior Magistrate Judge James Snyder denied the motion, ruling that police did not violate Anthony's rights. In the ruling, Judge Snyder wrote that when police could not confirm or deny the reports they were given, they were left with two separate identified callers who had no knowledge of the other, stating that a child had been murdered. This entry was intended to save a potential child fatality and was objectively reasonable for that limited purpose, given the information known to officers at the time of entry. Therefore, exigent circumstances existed to enter the apartment and did not violate the Fourth Amendment. Had officers here chosen to root through areas where a child could not have been found, for instance drawers or cabinets, the degree of intrusion would be much higher. Here, officers used a key to enter the apartment after knocking numerous times, were present inside for 2 to 3 minutes, long enough to search each room in areas where a child could be located, immediately exited, and obtained a warrant upon confirming no child was located, and were searching an apartment that had seemingly been abandoned by defendant. Meanwhile, in a move that had me actually cheering out loud when I read about it, Haley Kelly has filed a lawsuit against Anthony DeBaya and the Indiana Department of Child Services, who she says failed to take Nakota's claims about his father seriously. Despite Nakota's highly concerning statement that his father was going to kill him, DCS insisted the scheduled visitation must take place because it was ordered by the court. If they had taken Nakota's comments seriously and prevented the visit, Haley believes her son may still be alive. A decision has yet to be made in the lawsuit. As for the legal case against Anthony DeBaya, his jury trial before Judge Shatrice M. Flowers has been postponed 13 times since it was originally scheduled for November 23, 2020, mostly due to requests by the defense. It was most recently scheduled to begin on March 6, 2023, but it has now been pushed back to May 22. Anthony DeBaya, who will turn 40 in March, continues to be held in the Marion County Jail. I just hope with every fiber of my being that Nakota will someday be found. His mom and sister deserve to say goodbye to him and lay him to rest. Time for another quick sponsor break. Episode 37 of this podcast featured the horrific story of Scotty McMillan, a precious little red-haired 3-year-old who lived in a mobile home in West Collin Township, Pennsylvania, with his mom, Jillian Tate, his older brother, who I'll call RM, Jillian's short-term live-in boyfriend, Gary Fellenbaum, Gary's ex-wife, Amber Fellenbaum, and Gary and Amber's 11-month-old daughter. One morning, about 3 weeks after the couple moved in together, Scotty refused to eat a piece of cinnamon toast Gary prepared for him, which apparently caused Gary to lose what little mind he had. Over the last 3 days of Scotty's life, he was systematically tortured by Gary, who beat the little boy with a homemade whip, a metal rod, a frying pan, a piece of aluminum siding, his fists, and other implements of torture. He taped Scotty to a chair, and he also smashed Scotty's head repeatedly through the drywall. At one point, he hung the 3-year-old by his ankles from a door and beat him savagely. Worse yet, Jillian joined in the torture. She and Gary laughed while beating and tormenting her own toddler son. Amber, meanwhile, witnessed this brutal treatment of an innocent little boy and did nothing to stop it. While Scotty lay dying, Gary and Jillian went car shopping, picked up pizza, had sex, and took a nap. When police responded to the trailer home on November 4, 2014, they found Scotty lying on a deflated air mattress, beaten and savaged, his little nose bloody, his body covered with bruises and puncture wounds. Although Scotty was rushed to the hospital, he succumbed to his injuries in the ambulance on the way there. Gary Fellenbaum ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Jillian Tate pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, conspiracy, child endangerment, assault, and several other charges and received a sentence of 42 to 94 years in prison. Amber Fellenbaum pleaded guilty to 2 counts of third-degree felony child endangerment and 2 counts of misdemeanor reckless endangerment and was sentenced to 6.5 to 16 years in prison. Because the legal case had already concluded by the time I released that episode, I haven't had any updates to give since my initial coverage in November of 2020. I do have a couple for you now, though. In August of 2021, on my way to Philadelphia for a concert with my older son, I stopped off at Northwood Cemetery in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, to visit Scotty's grave. His final resting place is in such a beautiful, serene spot. His large black headstone was surrounded by angel figurines and Thomas the Tank Engine toys, and I added a little painted rock I made for Scotty. Sorry to have to spoil that with this spine-chilling bit of news. On January 4th, 2023, Amber Fellenbaum, now age 30, was released on parole. I was unable to confirm where she's living, but she may be staying with family in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There's nothing I can add to that to make it better, so on to the next update in Scotty's case. After Scotty died, people from around the world donated money to benefit his surviving brother, R.M., who witnessed Scotty's torture and murder. Caring citizens sent thousands of dollars worth of checks to Chester County in the interest of helping R.M. on his journey to healing. A financial trust was established to manage the donations. Then Chester County District Attorney Tom Hogan announced the formation of the trust in November of 2014, saying of R.M., "This child has been exposed to some things that no child should ever see or hear. He has lost his little brother. He was betrayed by the people who were supposed to care for him. The good people of this community cannot do anything to help Scotty except shed a tear and say a prayer, but we can all join together to help his brother rebuild his life." Hogan said that all funds donated would be placed in the care of the Chester County Angel Trust to protect them and ensure that all donations are used for the direct benefit of Scotty's brother. In January of 2023, over 8 years later, the daily local newspaper published an article revealing that R.M., who was now 13, hadn't received a penny from the trust, even though his adoptive parents had made multiple requests. His adoptive mother, who was his paternal aunt, said in an interview that R.M. watched his brother die. He was extremely traumatized. We have tried our best to help him, but what frustrates me is that the public felt for him and wanted to help him. And now that money is just sitting there, and we don't even know how much is in the trust. This is ridiculous. This isn't right. She said that attorney Lawrence Skip Persick, one of the co-trustees of the fund, made it clear to us he was not going to give us any money for anything. She and her husband tried to withdraw from the trust to send R.M. to summer camp, but Persick refused. The aunt said, "My understanding was the trust was going to be for his younger years and to help him heal. Healing a child is providing them with structure and activities that will help them improve themselves, help them socially. Sports, Boy Scouts, camp. We are doing what we can without the trust." Recently, she requested funds from the trust for multiple benefits for R.M., including trauma therapy, drum lessons and a drum set, martial arts classes, and a 4-week summer day camp program. In her email to Persick, she wrote, "As he had advanced into the teenage stage, the normal hormone fluctuations that come with a developing teen are exacerbated by his PTSD, and he is experiencing some behavioral problems as a result. There are activities that we would like to involve him in to help him as much as we can, but those activities come with a cost." Persick's response came a few weeks later, refusing to provide the family with funds or even the amount of the balance of the trust, saying, "I do not feel that it is in R.M.'s best interest to disclose that amount to any of you." He called the programs for which the parents had requested funding normal costs of raising a child. Persick refused to answer questions from the newspaper, saying that because the matter involved a child, it was not appropriate for me to comment. Another local attorney, Jeremiah Kane, represented R.M. as his court-appointed guardian after Scotty's murder, and has also functioned from time to time as an informal advisor to the family over the years. In an email, he told the newspaper of Persick, "He continues to this day to not share any funds, statements, or any pertinent information about the trust. Even the value of the funds, or increase of value, remains unknown by the family and me. I have to believe that the generous people who donated money all those years ago would join the family and me in questioning the conduct of Mr. Persick and his failure to be transparent in his handling of thousands of dollars. Given his continuing actions to frustrate the family at every attempt to gain some knowledge, I believe a new and transparent person should take over control of the trust." Almost a month after the initial Daily Local article, the newspaper released an update on the matter, announcing that Chester County Angel Trust officials planned to end their relationship with the trust, including Mr. Persick. The current co-trustees will continue to serve until a common pleas court judge appoints a new trustee. At last, Persick sent R.M.'s adoptive parents a financial report showing that the initial $38,000 in donations has grown to just over $62,000. Here's hoping the court will appoint a more cooperative trustee in the near future. Jillian Michelle Tate, now 39, is serving her sentence at SCI Muncie alongside Kim Moorer and the other, ladies I mentioned during Max's updates earlier in this episode. 31-year-old Gary Lee Fellenbaum III is imprisoned at SCI Huntington. In episodes 40 and 41, I told you the story of 2-week-old Caliyah McNabb. Caliyah was born 4 weeks premature at 5 pounds and 6 ounces, but she was a perfect little doll with dark blue eyes and dark brown hair. She had a possible club foot which doctors believed could be corrected with a cast. On October 7, 2017, Caliyah was reported missing by her parents, Christopher McNabb and Courtney Bell, from the family's cramped, messy mobile home in Covington, Georgia. The next day, Caliyah's tiny body was found in a drawstring bag in the woods just 250 yards from the trailer, suffering unspeakable injuries. Chris initially went on the run, but he was apprehended in short order. Months later, Courtney was also arrested on multiple charges, including murder. During a joint trial in 2019, Courtney Bell was convicted on 3 counts, including second-degree murder, and sentenced to 15 years in prison and 15 subsequent years on probation. Chris McNabb, who has an insanely lengthy criminal record and more tattoos on his face than I've ever seen before, was convicted on 8 counts, including malice murder, and sentenced to life plus 10 years. It is believed that Chris punched his newborn daughter in the head, causing multiple fatal skull fractures, and that Courtney contributed to the baby's death by allowing, according to the judge, a rattlesnake into her home, namely Chris McNabb. Those episodes were released in December of 2020, which was the most recent update I had on Caliyah's case. Since then, we've had a big one. Both Chris and Courtney filed appeals, asking the court for new trials. Both of those appeals were denied. Both then appealed to the state. In February of 2022, the Court of Appeals of Georgia overturned Courtney's convictions for murder and second-degree child cruelty, issuing an opinion that the evidence was insufficient. There was no evidence presented that Bell directly caused the victim cruel and excessive pain by inflicting blunt force trauma to her head, caused someone else to commit the act, aided or abetted in the act, or that she advised, encouraged, hired, counseled, or procured someone to commit the act. Courtney's attorney, Eric Crawford, told a reporter, "Ms. Bell is happy that the Court of Appeals found what she had argued all along, that she did not kill her child and played no part in McNabb's killing her child. With all of the negative public sentiment around Ms. Bell, mainly because her case was highly publicized and her trial streamed live over the internet, the Court of Appeals' action was both courageous and correctly decided. We look forward to getting back into court for the resentencing." Courtney's conviction for contributing to the dependency of a minor was affirmed. She will not be retried on the other charges. As of this recording, Courtney has not yet been resentenced. Last month, in January of 2023, the Georgia Supreme Court declined to hear Courtney's case and remitted it back to the trial court for resentencing. In May of 2022, the Georgia Supreme Court upheld Chris's conviction. He had argued that the evidence was insufficient to prove that he killed his daughter, but the court's ruling stated, "Whether alternative hypotheses for the murder are reasonable is usually a question for the jury, and this court will not disturb the jury's finding unless it is insufficient as a matter of law. As for malice murder, it is for the jury to determine from the facts and circumstances presented in evidence whether a killing is malicious. Although there was no direct evidence of premeditation or the exact manner in which Caliyah was killed, the evidence authorized the jury to determine that the circumstances of Caliyah's killing show an abandoned and malignant heart, and that McNabb was the person who inflicted her injuries." Chris had also argued that his defense was constitutionally ineffective at trial because his attorney had failed to object to evidence of McNabb's drug use, evidence that McNabb physically abused Bell, and evidence that McNabb and Bell are first cousins. I'm sorry, I know, but I can't resist. Anyway, the Georgia Supreme Court ruling determined that the agreement between the prosecution and the defense as to what evidence would be allowed was a strategic choice, and it was inevitable the couple's cousin status would come out in court through any number of family members who testified, adding, "The jury's understanding of a familial relationship between a defendant and a witness could affect the jury's assessment of the witness's credibility or potential bias, and provide context for the witness's testimony." Now age 29, Courtney Marie Bell is currently serving her existing sentence in Pulaski State Prison in Hawkinsville, Georgia. I'll let you know when I hear any update on her resentencing. 33-year-old Christopher Michael McNabb is serving life without parole in Hayes State Prison in Tryon, Georgia. I'll pause here for one final sponsor break. One final update for today's episode, and that's regarding the little guy whose story I told in September in episode 126, Dawson McKinney. On May 11, 2020, 2-month-old Dawson was rushed to St. Luke's Hospital in Boise, Idaho, suffering from severe traumatic closed head injuries, including bleeding on the brain, retinal injuries, and a skull fracture. 4 days later, with his daddy, former U.S. Marine Adam McKinney, by his bedside, Dawson died from his injuries on May 15, 2020. Dawson's mother, 26-year-old Danielle Radu, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She told police multiple stories about how Dawson was injured. He fell off a couch, she tripped and fell while carrying him, and finally, that during a moment of frustration, she put the baby forcefully on the floor. She insisted she had not intended to hurt her son. In early April of 2022, Danielle entered an Alford plea to the charge of first-degree murder, admitting the prosecution had enough evidence to convict her, but maintaining her innocence. Sentence-wise, an Alford plea in Idaho is handled the same way a guilty plea would be. In June, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. Danielle was transferred from the custody of the Ada County Sheriff's Office last week, and although she is not currently in an Idaho Department of Corrections facility, I'm guessing she will be shortly. On the IDOC website, her parole eligibility date is listed as April 26, 2040. Now, here's the most important update in Dawson's story, and I can say with confidence that it's one of the happiest updates I've ever had the privilege to relay. This weekend, I heard from Dawson's daddy, Adam McKinney, who let me know that on the evening of Friday, February 23, 2023, Dawson's baby sister made her grand appearance. She was 7 pounds, 13 ounces, and 20 inches long. She is an absolutely perfect, healthy little girl with a head full of long, beautiful hair, red just like her daddy's, and in one of the pictures Adam sent me, she's wearing a onesie that reads, "Handpicked for Earth by my big brother in heaven." If you've heard Dawson's episode, you'll understand how meaningful dolphins are to his family. Well, imagine their surprise when they entered the hospital for his baby sister's birth and saw a huge sign about dolphins on the nurse's station. Adam told me they felt Dawson's presence throughout the entire hospital stay. I couldn't be happier for Adam and his family, and I wish them all the health, happiness, and success the world can possibly give them. My sources for these updates were WV News, 12 WBOY, the West Virginia Department of Corrections website, VineLink, Shaw Local, WSPY News, the Illinois Department of Corrections website, the Lebanon Daily News, Facebook, Penn Live Patriot News, the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections website, WRTV, Fox 59, Wish TV, Indy.gov, the Daily Local, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, 11 Alive, the Georgia Court of Appeals website, the Georgia Supreme Court website, the Georgia Department of Corrections website, the Idaho Department of Corrections website, and Adam McKinney. That's it for this week. Join me next week for another episode. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. For more stories like the one you heard today, visit sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.